It was 1944. The Second World War was still raging. It was the year of the invasion of Normandy, an event that would become known as the largest invasion force in human history. Even people living in the small town of Mattoon, Illinois, felt the effects of the war as many of the town's able-bodied men had joined the fight. But soon people would find themselves with other things to worry about. During September that same year, people living in the town started showing symptoms of exposure to poison gas, such as nausea, vomiting, and lightheadedness. The victims would all report smelling a sweet, cheap perfume odor in their homes before falling ill. Soon, there were many reports of gas attacks in the city, and the name given to the one believed to be responsible for these apparent gas attacks was the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. The first reported attack happened on August 31st, 1944. Urban Rafe and his wife had been asleep in their bed when Urban was awakened during the early hours of the morning by a strange odor in his house. He felt nauseated and weak, which got so bad that he started vomiting. His wife suspected that there might be a gas leak in the house, so she tried to get out of the bed to check the kitchen stove to see if there was a problem with the pilot light. But she found that she could not move and she was unable to leave her bed. That same night, a young mother living nearby would report a similar incident. She would be awakened by the sound of her daughter coughing, but when she tried to get up to check on her, she found herself unable to leave the bed. The very next day, September 1st, there was another incident when Mrs. Kearney had noticed a strong, sweet odor seeping into her bedroom at around 11 p.m. At first she believed that the smell came from the flowers outside the window, but the odor would become stronger and stronger. Soon she found herself losing feeling in her legs, which made her panic and call for her sister, who was staying at the house at the time. Her sister rushed into the room and immediately noticed the strange smell, which she determined came from the direction of the bedroom window, which had been open. The police would be contacted, but there were no signs of a prowler. Then, at around 12:30 a.m., Mrs. Kearney's husband, Bert, would return home from his work as a taxi driver to see a strange figure standing close to one of the house's windows. Mr. Kearney tried apprehending this suspect, but was unsuccessful. He would later describe this figure as a tall man, dressed in dark clothing and wearing a tight-fitting cap. In addition to feeling paralyzed, Mrs. Kearney would also report a burning sensation on her lips and her throat, which would be attributed to the effects of the gas. It was initially believed that robbery was the motive for the attack, and this incident with Mrs. Kearney would be incorrectly reported as the first gasser attack by local newspapers. In the days following the Kearney attack, more attacks would be reported, but none of the victims were able to provide a clear description of the prowler, and there were no clues found at the scene of the alleged attacks. In fact, the first bit of physical evidence would be found on the night of September 5th. Carl and Beulah Cords had returned home at around 10 p.m. When they arrived home, they noticed a piece of white cloth that was lying on their porch next to the screen door. Mrs. Cords picked up the cloth, brought it to her face and inhaled without thinking. Immediately, her face began to swell. She felt a burning sensation in her mouth and throat, and she also began to vomit. She felt weak and found that she couldn't move her legs. It would take more than 2 hours before she began to feel normal again. In this incident, the motive was also believed to have been robbery. In a later statement, Mrs. Cords would wonder if the cloth had been left on the porch to knock out the family dog, which usually slept there. The cloth would be analyzed by the authorities, but they couldn't find anything on it that explained the reaction that Mrs. Cords had after smelling the cloth. The cloth wasn't the only thing found on the scene, though. A skeleton key would also reportedly be found on the sidewalk adjacent to the porch, and there was also a large tube of lipstick that was almost empty. The incident at the Cords' home wasn't the only one reported that night. Another report would come from a Mrs. Burrell, who reported seeing a stranger break in through her bedroom window and then attempt to gas her. 1 week after news of the alleged gassings had begun to spread, the Journal-Gazette would criticize city officials for their handling of the case. They wrote that the community's police force was understaffed and claimed that political infighting had hampered this case, as well as other investigations. Other newspapers quickly picked up this story, and this led to increased concern over these alleged gassings. Women in the town started carrying bats and clubs whenever they left the house, and many people began staying with friends rather than sleeping alone. Many townspeople also headed out at night armed with shotguns and pistols. And this led to the police issuing a statement urging people to exercise restraint when carrying or discharging firearms. Local police received many reports from panicked citizens thinking that they smelled gas or that they had seen someone prowling their neighborhood. Many of these proved to be false alarms, and by September 12th, the police would reduce the priority afforded to these gasser reports. Also by September 12th, the police would declare that the gas attacks had a logical explanation, and they blamed these reports on mass hysteria related to the worries that everyone felt regarding the war. After this announcement, there was a decrease in gasser reports before eventually they stopped completely. The only report of note after the police's announcement came from a Bertha Birch, who claimed that she had seen the gasser, and the person that she had seen was a woman that was dressed as a man. There are three main theories about the Mattoon Mad Gasser incident: mass hysteria, industrial pollution, or an actual physical assailant. The most common proposed explanation for this case is mass hysteria. In fact, this explanation has even been used in college psychology classes as an example of mass hysteria. And it was also the explanation that the police offered in their September 12th announcement. Around 2 weeks after the attacks began, Thomas Wright, who was the local commissioner of public health, declared that while there had been a few actual gas attacks, most of the reported attacks were likely due to hysteria. This theory would be given more credibility in 1945 when the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology published a report that looks at the case of the Mad Gasser as an example of mass hysteria. It has also been suggested that many of the symptoms reported during the Mattoon incident, such as choking, weakness, or temporary paralysis, were all symptoms of that hysteria. There are also those who theorize that the press played a part in fueling this hysteria. One example of this is a headline that was published in the Mattoon Journal-Gazette, which read, "Mrs. Kearney and daughter first victims." It's been suggested that this headline is what gave people the impression that there would be more attacks, which fueled the growing panic. But there's also been those who have criticized the mass hysteria theory. The book, The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, Dispelling the Hysteria by Scott Maruna, presents a different look at the events. The book looks at the facts surrounding the reports, the investigation, and even similar events in other cities across the United States. In the end, Maruna dismisses the idea that mass hysteria was the cause. Instead, he points to a real person as the culprit, a local man named Farley Llewellyn. Farley had studied chemistry at university, and he had even built a laboratory in the trailer in which he lived. He was also reportedly shunned by the community for being gay. Maruna writes that he had the knowledge and the means to create a poison gas, not to mention that he also had the motive. But there are some holes to this theory, such as Farley had been under surveillance at the time. In fact, he had been at home when some of the attacks occurred. While some people believe that Farley could have been the culprit, others are not so sure. Other writers have suggested that some of the Gasser incidents were the work of an actual attacker, given that some of the earliest reports did say that they had seen someone prowling outside their home, though Farley Llewellyn is the only one mentioned by name that I could find. The third theory says that the Gasser incidents were the results of pollution in combination with mass hysteria. On September 12th, when local chief of police C.E. Cole announced that there had likely been no gas attacks at all, he also claimed that the reported incidents had probably been triggered by chemicals carried on the wind from nearby industrial facilities. The smell of these chemicals would then become reports of gas attacks by a panicked public. He speculated that either carbon tetrachloride or trichloroethylene was the cause of these symptoms, and also the sweet odor that some victims had reported. Carbon tetrachloride is a chemical that is mainly used as a dry cleaning solvent, degreasing agent, refrigerant, fumigant, or in fire extinguishers. Trichloroethylene is mostly used as a solvent to remove grease from metal parts. It's also an ingredient in adhesives, paint removers, typewriter correction fluids, and spot removers. Both of these chemicals have a sweet odor and can cause headaches, dizziness, nauseousness, or confusion. This statement by the police chief would cause the company Atlas Imperial to issue a response. They released a statement saying that their facility only had 5 gallons of carbon tetrachloride in stock, which were contained in firefighting equipment. They also denied that trichloroethylene was responsible for any sickness in the town, arguing that it would take a significant quantity of that chemical to cause that reaction. To this day, it's unclear who or what was responsible for the attacks. Was it an actual assailant, chemicals from nearby factories, or mass hysteria? Or maybe it was all three of those combined. After all, the local commissioner of public health did say that there were a few actual gas attacks by an assailant, but that the majority of the reported cases were just hysteria. Cases of mass hysteria have occurred in the past, and human imagination and embellishment can be a powerful thing when panic sets in. But if the gasser was an actual person, what was his or her motive? Was it Farley Llewellyn, or was it someone else? There's also been those who have suggested conspiracy theories. One such theory is that this incident was the result of the American government testing a new vapor-based weapon on an unsuspecting public, which is why the police was so quick to dismiss it all and blame it on something else, and why the case was not handled the way it should have been. Regardless of what the truth may be, this case is not without its contradictions. One theory might fit some of the details, but not others. Perhaps one day we will learn the actual truth of what happened, but for now it makes for an interesting moment in time.